People, get freaked out that the currency is weakening. They tend to queue up at banks. It may destabilize the banking system. It will create a lot of nervousness amongst the Russian population, and that risks social and political unrest in Russia, and will put pressure on Putin to come to the negotiating table.
The Russian economy, it's dropped to its lowest rate against the dollar since the first week of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The New Statesman has said that the Russian economy is doomed. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, there's been a lot of durability through the war. The reality is Putin knew he was going to invade. If you go back to February 22, probably for the prior period since the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. So Putin was building up his buffers, building up Russia's buffers. They had something like 600 billion in foreign exchange reserves, $600 billion, I should say, in foreign exchange reserves just before the invasion in February 22. They deleveraged, they'd reduced debts, the budget was in surplus, the current account, that's the trade balance, was also in surplus. So they had lots of insulation for a period of difficult relationships with the West, particularly sanctions. So, sanctions were rolled out. They were perhaps too soft with hindsight. We gave the Russians too much prior warning about them. And I said they had lots of insulation. So, that they've managed to ride through, the last 1,000 days of the war in Ukraine. But actually now things are beginning to the rubber's beginning to hit the road in many respects. We've seen a tightening of sanctions in the last 3 to 4 months, some particularly significant ones. We saw the American sanction MOEX, which is the big foreign exchange bureau in Moscow. It helps Russian companies basically trade foreign currency around their trade relations. So it allows them to get dollars in payment for those exports of Russian oil and energy. Sanctioning made it very difficult for those companies to transact in dollars and get those dollars. We've also seen in recent days Gazprom Bank, big Russian bank, that facilitates, again, trade in energy for Russia. That was sanctioned. We've seen a lot of new secondary sanctions by the West on Russia. Secondary sanctions are you sanction countries, individuals and companies for helping Russia get around sanctions. We've not done enough of that, frankly. It's easy for many people, countries, companies make a lot of money helping Russia circumvent sanctions. So they've been tightened. So those kind of measures have kind of freaked out Russian markets in the last few days. We've seen the ruble take a big hit. It's been down around 7% in recent days, about 15% over the last month. It's trading at near record lows. A weaker ruble is a sign of vulnerability and weakness. That's generally, when countries' currencies wobble, things generally are not going particularly well. It means higher inflation. It means the central bank will have to respond with higher policy rates. Ultimately, that means lower growth. Higher inflation, lower growth will ultimately hurt Russian consumers, the Russian population. The hope is obviously that causes social and political pressure on Putin to do the right thing in Ukraine, which is not invade and stop the war.
And it's interesting because in April, the IMF, they claimed that the Russian economy would grow faster than any of the G7 countries, didn't it? So why now is Russia facing such a drop in the economy? Is this just due to these recent US sanctions, or are there other things at play here?
Well, I think so. I mentioned some of those buffers that were built in. I think they've been gradually worn away. The West, I mentioned $600 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Early after the invasion, the West immobilized $330 billion of central bank of Russia reserves. So they've been put beyond Russia. And I think over the last 1,000 days, those buffers have been worn away. So it's a combination of tighter sanctions. The buffers have been worn away. So finally, I think Russia is going into a much more difficult economic place. You mentioned the durability of the Russian economy. What we've seen is this guns versus butter dilemma and choices. The Russian politicians, Putin has made Russia a war economy. He's diverted production from consumer goods to military goods. We've seen, if you think of the Second World War in the UK, it can be quite effective. But ultimately, someone's got to pay a price. right? I mean, it has actually, even before the latest sanctions measures, inflation has been a problem. There's been a shortage of labour. Imports, sanctions make imports more expensive. Inflation was a problem already. The ruble drop this week, or the last few weeks, I should say, will just make that inflation problem even bigger. So I think the IMF forecasts were optimistic. The IMF has its golden ball, or what you want to call it. It tries to look in the future. It's always right. I think things are going to get more difficult. And I think what we're seeing actually is the Biden administration understanding that there's a new administration in the US, the Trump presidency. There's a likelihood that we are going to see negotiations. I think there would be peace negotiations in Ukraine, whoever had won the US election, actually. But there's an opportunity here for the Biden administration to tighten the noose around Russia, weaken its negotiating position, help the position of the Ukrainians. A weaker Russian economy will likely make Putin more willing to negotiate, more willing to give concessions in the war in Ukraine. And we've seen, beyond actually the financial sanctions imposed on Russia in recent weeks, we saw the decision to allow the Ukrainians to use longer range missiles in Russia. We've seen provision of landmines. Again, these are all aimed at forcing Russia to the negotiating table and improving the Ukrainians' position. And a weaker Russian economy will certainly help the Ukrainians and hinder the Russians.
And following on from that, the oil industry and the oil trade in Russia, it's become even more significant for Russia, especially since the war in Ukraine as well. How do you see this drop in the economy, the weakening of the ruble, impacting trade with oil for Russia?
Well, we've seen a diversion of energy exports from the Western Europe to other parts of the world. Places like India, China, etc., have picked up the slack. We haven't seen much disruption from sanctions to the global economy. Now, Russia is still supplying that energy to key markets for it in Asia, as I mentioned, India, etc. And if it decided that, well, it's not getting paid for those goods, it will stop exporting them. It would damage some of those longer-term relationships. So I think it's going to continue to try and sell. It's just getting difficulty getting the money from those sales. And China's, some of those partners are long-term partners. Obviously, China is a really important strategic partner. China is really interested in global markets not being destabilized, right? So it will work with Russia to make sure, supply chains remain supplied with energy to minimize the disruption in terms of global energy markets. Interestingly, it also comes at a time, I guess, where with the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire deal, maybe tensions in the Middle East have moderated. That we're also seeing, the Trump presidency talk about deregulation, increasing production of oil and energy, so potential more supply of oil and energy to international markets. That will act as a counter, so if you were worried about difficulties in the Russian economy, tighter sanctions, limiting Russian oil and energy exports, there seems to be plenty of slack elsewhere in the global economy. Other supply opportunities which will moderate any damaging impact on global oil prices.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on something I read. They were suggesting that a weaker ruble, it could benefit Putin as it will fill the state budget because of huge defense spending and potentially increase annual and gas budget revenues. What do you make of that?
No, it's true. Russia it earns exports receipts from energy in dollars. It spends in rubles. It pays soldiers' salaries in rubles. If the ruble is weaker, when it sells the oil and converts them into rubles, it gets more rubles per your dollar. So it helps the revenue side of the budget. That's that. I mean, it helps them balance the budget, but it doesn't really solve the problem that a weaker currency causes inflation. I mean, that's a harsh reality. And sanctions mean that Russia is getting less dollars for every barrel of oil it gets. It makes transacting in oil and energy and other exports, commodities, etc., from Russia much more expensive. You can always get around sanctions, right? But the entities that are helping you get around sanctions charge a big premium, right? They want extra money for taking the law into their own hands and risking secondary sanctions themselves. So, look, in the end, the net dollar receipts to Russia reduces because of all this. That's less dollars for Russia to wage war on Ukraine. It's less dollars for Russia to rejuvenate its military machine that ultimately is not just a threat to Ukraine, but it's also a threat to NATO and the Western alliance. We should have an interest in economically weakening Russia.
And so, all in all, would you say that this will have a negative impact on Russia's efforts on the war in Ukraine?
No, absolutely. As I said, generally, currency devaluations are not good news. Countries don't like much, they don't like rapidly weakening currencies. It's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of economic trouble. It unnerves populations. People, get freaked out that the currency is weakening. They tend to queue up at banks. It may destabilize the banking system. It will create a lot of nervousness amongst the Russian population, and that risks social and political unrest in Russia, and will put pressure on Putin to come to the negotiating table. A lot's been made of the fact that Russia is a big economy. It can wage a war for a very long time. It's true, but there are risks for Putin of a long war. More deaths, more casualties, more soldiers coming back in coffins. The risk of, you remember the Prigozhin, Wagner mutiny. There's a risk of social and political unrest in Russia that Putin doesn't want. So yes, he can in theory wage a long war, but it's not risk free. And a weakening ruble and a weakening Russian economy, is one of the things that Putin has to think about in terms of his decisions about a continuation of this war. It's not a good thing for Russia, a weaker currency. Absolutely not.
And as we move into winter, how do you see, or is there any indications of how the ruble will fare moving forward, especially into this season?
Well, it's not going to improve. I think we're going to see more Western sanctions, more efforts by the Biden administration just prior to Trump taking office, trying to make life more difficult for Putin and the Russian economy. They will have to make difficult decisions. The difficult decisions are they'll have to raise interest rates to defend the currency. That's not cost-free. Higher interest rates means lower growth, less investment. Difficult choices, right? Not easy. They may have to waste scarce foreign exchange reserves to defend the currency. Again, that reduces the reserves of Russia, the resilience of Russia. Unless we see an early end to the war, I don't think things are going to get any better, particularly for the Russian economy and Russia, actually.
Are there any other means by which the West can help to influence Putin's hand when it comes to potential Trump negotiations?
I mean, the one thing that hasn't been done so far that the West could do, which would make life even more difficult for the Russians and help the Ukrainians particularly, and again, in this idea that we're going into negotiations, peace negotiations, you want to improve the negotiations with the Ukrainians, is the West is still sitting on 330 billion of immobilized Russian assets, central bank of Russia reserve assets. We could move those to Ukraine or to a fund supporting Ukraine now, and that would give Ukraine an ability to continue to fund itself even with a Trump presidency. It would give itself the cash to continue to fund its own defense and buy weapons from the Trump administration. And again, that would send a message to Putin that, actually Ukraine can endure an extended war. So actually, it's probably better for Russia to sit down and negotiate an early end to the conflict. So that's one to watch for. I think it would send a very strong message from G7 to Putin in particular.
Do you think that's plausible within the time frame before, Trump gets sworn in as president?
Well, it's about political will. It only requires an executive order from the Biden administration. I know a lot of the money is not in the US, it's in Europe, but the Biden administration have all the tools to make that happen. They can force European financial institutions to comply with that particular order. They have the legal means to do it. It's about political will. And it's about forcing the Europeans to do it. I mean, it's kind of ironic that there's a lot of criticism of Trump, particularly around NATO, but the reality is Europe has not pulled its finger out in funding its own defence and helping the Ukrainians. If the US pulls away, Europe is going to have to fund a much larger part of its own defence. Defence spending, remember there's a 2% of GDP NATO defence spending target. Without the Americans, Europe will probably have to go to 3-4% of GDP. That's a huge increase in annual defence spending. The cheapest way would be actually to use these immobilised Russian assets of 330 billion, let the Ukrainians fund their own defence. And if the Ukrainians win the war, we're in a safer Europe and we won't have to spend all that money countering the threat from Russia.